Hey guys, one of the rare repeat guests because that's how incredible he is. Today I've got back with us physician and addiction expert, Dr. Drew Pinsky. How you doing, Drew?
I don't think I've ever been described as incredible, but thank you for that. The
Let
incredible
me,
part is just spending time with you, sir. That's what I like.
you are way too kind. Let me just read some of your bio stuff. You could follow Dr. Drew's work on drdrew.com, which includes popular podcasts such as Dr. Drew After Dark, The Adam and Drew Show. By the way, I'll be on Adam Carolla's show when the book comes out in
Oh, good.
later this summer, as
Well,
well
I've
as
got
his live streaming shows, Ask Dr. Drew and Dose of Dr. Drew, with links available at drdrew.tv. You are a contributor on Fox LA with Alex Michelson and a regular host on MTV's Teen Mom. Do all of these things still hold true?
the Fox News thing I was doing every night locally here in Los Angeles for about a year, and now I just contribute now and then. But
Okay, gotcha.
that was a lot of fun. We were just sort of trying to keep people up on what was the craziness. We was sort of it was marketed as a COVID special every night. So
Got you. You used to be a regular on the Dr. Oz show since
yeah,
it no longer is on air, and you were the eagle on The Masked Singer on Fox.
yeah.
Your books include the New York Times bestseller The Mirror Effect: How Celebrity Narcissism is Seducing America, and Cracked: Putting Broken Lives Together Again. Did I cover some of the key highlights, or do you want to add anything before we get going?
I've just been on TV forever. I've done lots of TV, all different stripes. Sort of, I the other day was looking at, I was looking at, I used to try to keep up a sort of a CV of appearances and stuff. And I just thought, I have been on every damn, there's no show I haven't been on, just nothing. So I've been on it. You can find me everywhere.
Now, I wanted maybe the most important highlight in your CV is
Yeah.
that you made it to the back of this book.
Yes.
There were 7 very illustrious blurbers who were kind enough to blurb for me. But on the back of the book, here comes Megan Kelly. Here comes the gorgeous and delightful Dr. Drew. And here comes Dr. Jordan Peterson. So thank you
I
for that
feel
lovely
I
blurb.
feel extremely privileged to be blurbing amongst those blurbers.
Okay, so what I thought we would do,
as, as you said to me once, comment ça se fait?
but by the way, for the people who don't know, vous parlez français, Dr. Drew,
Oui,
correct?
un peu. Oui, oui.
Un tout
Ouais.
petit peu?
Mais petit, ouais, plus qu'un petit, mais je ne parle pas bien.
Right. Oh, il faut qu'on améliore notre accent.
Oui, améliorer ça. Et maîtriser ma grammaire.
So I just said we might need to ameliorate our accent, and
Yep.
then Dr. Drew added, and maybe improve my grammar. French
Yeah.
grammar is not easy,
Yeah.
as I can attest, seeing now my children. I mean, I learned French before I did English, so it's kind of like a mother tongue to me. But
Yeah.
now that I haven't been immersed in French in my professional life, and I see some of their conjugations and so on, I'm like, oh, thank God I finished with all that business, right?
Not only that, I don't know if this holds true in Canada, but in France, they speak 3 different languages. Spoken French is 3 different things. And they have the Académie Française, which is the language police,
Yes.
which Richelieu set up 500 years ago. And the other 2 versions are sort of rebellions against that, including, in addition to their slang, which they call argot, there's a pig Latin they do. They inverse things. It's like no wonder I don't understand French when I go over there.
Well, it's funny you say this because my wife has the linguistic chameleon ability to switch a different French accent depending on, with
Quebec,
whom she's interacting. So
Quebec
since
or Parisian.
exactly, so
Yeah.
she can speak kind of an international French, which really rings nicely to my ear because that's how I speak it. But
Yeah.
then she can go into what's called joual, like really, really hardcore Quebecer, which doesn't ring nicely to my ear.
No, I
And
can't
so,
even go
so
through it.
probably one of the only, not fights, but the only things where we have a little spiciness between us, I'll turn around to her when she's speaking that. I go, what the hell was that? She's like, come on, they won't take me seriously if I don't speak their language. I can't do that.
I need a tutor. I think I'm going to call your wife. Just 15 minutes on the phone would really help me. Please.
Sounds good. Okay, so what I thought we would do is take your
That makes me
expert.
happy, by the way.
Oh, what a segue. That's exactly where I was going to get to. So I wanted to maybe start off our conversation linking some of the stuff that I discuss in my forthcoming book on happiness with some of the stuff that you've spent decades,
Yeah.
treating and dealing with,
Yeah, yeah.
addiction. So
Yeah.
question one, does being happy serve as somewhat of an inoculation against the proclivity of becoming addicted?
It depends what you mean by happiness. Okay. How, because people oftentimes, we particularly in this country, we are so, we are given the right to pursue happiness, and we have taken that word and gone crazy places with it. So why don't we define happiness first? How do you define it?
Well, there are, of course, in the academic literature, there are all kinds of ways by which we can parse it. Let's use the most colloquial understanding of happiness. I wake up in the morning with a sense of existential well-being. My
Well-being.
life of
Yeah, so well-being. Okay. Because we in this country, I think we have distorted it into what is called hedonic happiness or
right.
euphoria. And we're supposed to be euphoric all the time. We're supposed to be gloriously happy with everything all the time. And that's just nobody. That's not, in fact, that is not good. I think it was Schopenhauer that said, I go from satisfaction to desire back to, satisfaction and then back to desire. And if your euphoric pursuit is what you're after, it'll just be one thing after another. You'll never be fulfilled. But well-being, I think is exactly the right place to start. And in order to have experienced well-being, you have to not be in extreme pain. You have to have basic needs met. You have to not be hungry and distressed, or your life being endangered in some way. It's hard to feel good in those kinds of situations. So it's a given that you have to be like okay in order to start to feel well-being. But beyond that, I sort of like the term flourishing. How is human flourishing contribute to well-being? And to your question, yes, genes are not destiny. Addiction is underpinned by a genetic disorder. 60% of addiction is accounted for on the basis of genetics alone, but of course 40% is environment. And what are those environmental triggers? Usually some need to regulate. Typically it's a regulatory imbalance. Oftentimes it's childhood trauma with carrying that pain and dysregulation forward, oftentimes without people really even being aware of it. But if you are experiencing well-being, you're well regulated, you're not likely to continue to pursue a substance, and certainly not going to pursue really serious substances. For instance, opiate addicts are usually trying to avoid psychic pain. They carry pain with them that they're often not aware of. Alcoholics sometimes just like alcohol a lot, and you can still trigger alcoholism with certain genetic burdens. But to some extent, yes, well-being is one of the inoculations against this condition.
Got you. Now, in my book, as you know, you looked through it before blurbing it.
Yeah, I loved it.
Thank you so much. I discuss various correlates with happiness that have been studied. Happiness and religiosity, happiness and a good marriage. Happiness in different cultural settings, happiness and being feeling content at work.
Yep.
Of all of the possible correlates to happiness, is there one or two that you would consider most likely? So my first question was, does happiness inoculate you against addiction?
Yes.
But now I'm drilling down into the granular correlates of happiness.
Yep.
If I am married, does that reduce my chances of being addicted? If I am religious, does that? So what are your thoughts on those?
So I think the contribution of religion is more something we'd call spiritual fulfillment. And that is a really challenging landscape for me because it's so many different things to so many different people. Let me just say it's important, as I'm sure people reading your book will discover. It's important, and to some extent, includes a relationship with a higher power. which is what I want to say, that really for me, the key ingredient in happiness is relational.
Yes.
And you mentioned marriage. That chapter really caught me, by the way, and I think it caught your wife's attention too. I think she felt pretty good about it, and so did mine, by the way. But it's not just a happy, stable marriage. It is the capacity for entering a relational frame that is close and intimate, and that is not an easy task for a lot of people. Forget choosing the right person and sort of navigating life together and all these very complex and difficult things. Frankly, just the beginning phenomenon of entering the frame of relationship and doing it in a way where you are fully vulnerable and open, i.e. intimate, very hard for people these days. And so I do think the one thing I would say is the key underpinning is some sort of relational something. It can be with a higher power. I happen to believe it needs to be with other human beings, but I've
Yes.
certainly seen people who are fulfilled without it. And I personally, I kind of back into spirituality through relationships with human beings. I really feel like that's where I see spirituality. This
I
thing that
agree.
this thing that people co-create, we call a relationship, is a wholly separate entity, wholly separate substance from you and me. And that is where you and me are deeply affected by each other, but it is a separate thing that we create together. And that thing has real transcendent value.
Well, so let me mention something that just happened today. Earlier, I posted a tweet. I don't know if you saw it, where I was, sharing publicly my affection for you as a somewhat new friend, right? Last couple of years, and then Jay Batasharia, who happens to be one of the other blurbers of my book. I can't believe that I'm fortunate enough to get
The best.
these kinds of incredible people to blurb my book. He writes, unknown to both of us, well, like a lovely sentence. And in that small moment, even though it was in a public setting, I felt an incredible communion with two guys whom a couple of years ago I didn't know, who are,
Yeah.
I can't imagine my life being as rich as it currently is if I didn't have the opportunity to meet such people. So your point about relations is completely right. And as a matter of fact, it is supported, as you know, by a lot of very serious science. Robert Waldinger, who is coming on my show this Friday,
Amazing.
who is the director of I think the longest longitudinal study. I think it's called the Harvard Adult Development Study.
Yep.
He quotes findings, which I'll mention, that you could add to it, Drew, also as a physician, that if you take people's cholesterol scores when they're 50, and then another metric is you look at the quality of their relationships.
Yeah.
When they're 80, the quality of the relationships is a better predictor of their health outcomes than their cholesterol scores at age 50.
That makes very good sense to me, and I'm sure you can really follow that across the lifespan. And it's only the last 20 years or so we've started looking at adverse childhood experiences as a scale and we backed into it, even though those of us working in mental health, it was immensely obvious, but they backed into it through the medical system. They started noticing that people with 3 or 5 or 7 adverse childhood experiences had worse health outcomes. Shocking. Look, at the very minimum, being able to manage impulses is a regulatory challenge, and regulation happens in the intersubjectivity is how the brain builds regulation. Because all of this we're talking about, I keep talking about regulation, begs the question, how do people develop a regulatory system normally? And that is with other brains focusing on us, offering us metabolized emotions alongside of the emotions they attune of our own. That's how we build regulation. And that happens throughout the lifespan. So if I'm having trouble managing my appetite and I don't have good relationships, it's going to be I'm going to be extra challenged trying not to eat healthy things. I'm going to want to fill my discontent and my dysregulation with the glazed donuts.
Beautiful. I recently had Asim Malhotra on my show. I don't. Do you know who that is?
Oh yeah.
Okay, right.
I think I found him first. I think I was the first to put him on.
Well, there you go. I was following your glorious suit. Well, I asked him on the show because I said, okay, well, fine. I understand that relationships have a positive benefit on our health, but what are the proximate mechanisms that result in that, right? It can't be booga booga. It ultimately has to be, has to be, grounded in some material reality.
Yeah.
And his explanation, he said that there's now some growing evidence that suggests that it works through kind of the inflammation argument, right? That having good relationships somehow serves as a, it reduces the likelihood of an inflammatory response. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Well, we know that it reduces central nervous system cortisol. And cortisol is a marker, a surrogate for inflammation, really. But I'll up that with another mechanism, which is our autonomic nervous system is the source of regulation. Feelings come from the body. Bodily based feelings come through the vagus nerve. That is the afferent system from our body. That's something not taught in medical school. We were taught it slows the heart down, affects the acid secretion by the stomach. That's about it. No, something like 70 to 80% of is afferent, going back to the brain. And that's all kinds of information that we really don't even understand how it works. All those different nervous plexi, over our abdomen and our chest. It's like these peripheral brains we have in our body, but they're sending information back through the vagus nerve. And that is the regulatory system that at its core is how emotional regulation works, is by regulating bodily based expression of the autonomic nervous system. And of course, if we are in a fight or flight response all the time, that is unhealthy. That is a stress on the system. At very minimum, that increases shear forces on arteries at the sort of branching points, which increases cholesterol deposition and narrowing of the arteries and all that. That's just one of many mechanisms. So I would put a lot of it on the autonomic nervous system and its regulation.
Beautiful. One of the things that I tried to do in the book, as you know, is I try to have the right melange of, personal stories. Here's my experience navigating the, Mount Happiness, linking it to ancient wisdoms, and then linking it to contemporary science, but not just, behavioral science and positive psychology, also looking for things like physiological markers and medical markers that link happiness so you get the full story. So one set of studies that I love, and I don't know if you remember them from the book, is the work on job control. And you mentioned just a few minutes ago cortisol levels. So Michael Marmot, I don't know if you know does that ring a bell?
No, don't know him.
Well, he's a social epidemiologist, so he studies things like how does where you are in a organizational hierarchy.
Oh, I've seen stuff like this. Yeah.
I mean, it's fantastic, right, Drew? So it comes, so just to give the background, so Robert Sapolsky has done all that work, the neurobiologist at Stanford, with baboon society. They're very hierarchical. And then the top baboon will have lower cortisol levels. You might think that he has higher cortisol levels because
he has higher testosterone.
Exactly. He has higher testosterone, lower, whereas the lower down the rung you go, the higher the cortisol levels. So Marmot took this idea, which by the way is covered in one of his books called The Status Syndrome. And he demonstrated that when you look at specific, well-structured organizations, the guy who's at the top, the CEO, has much lower cortisol levels than the one at the lowest rank. One of the mechanisms that causes that stress, and that I try to kind of really hammer on, is whether you have temporal freedom in your job or not. So let me explain in my personal context, right? About 20 minutes before you and I were chatting, I was on my stationary bike outside. It's 75 degrees and I'm sweating it out. Now, I still might end up working 14 hours today. So it's not that I'm not working, but I'm in control of my time. Now I'm going to have a great conversation with Drew. Then I might go for a coffee with my wife. Then I might work on my next book till midnight, but I'm in control. Whereas the person who doesn't have that control has to go to the bathroom when it is mandated by the union. So do you buy that idea that our cortisol levels are ultimately linked to how much temporal freedom we have in our jobs?
I just think freedom generally is an interesting topic when it pertains to that. Freedom and sense of personal efficacy. I think both would, I think it's you're just zeroing in on the fact that you are in control of your destiny throughout the day rather than somebody else's, under somebody else's thumb. And personal creativity, efficacy, all these things are extremely important psychological principles for happiness.
So true, because actually in the book, I basically, I try to be humble when I'm offering prescriptions where I don't say, do these things and I guarantee you happiness, but rather I say, look, if you adopt these principles or adopt these mindsets, it will increase your probability of reaching happiness.
Right.
And so when it comes to discussing jobs, what I argue specifically, because you mentioned the word just now, being creative, I argue that jobs that afford you the possibility to instantiate your creative impulse, all other things equal, are going to provide you with greater purpose and meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that the insurance adjuster is not living a dignified professional life and we need him or her, but they can't be waking up in the morning, rubbing their hands with glee and saying, I am so excited that I'm an insurance adjuster. But when you are a chef, or an architect or an author, you're immersed in the creative process. That's got to increase your chances of happiness.
And if you are you have a job that is reasonably fulfilling in some way or another, a lot of people continue to use that job to pursue happiness by giving them financial ability on the other side to pursue, again, hobbies or whatever creative experiences that do more dramatically impact happiness.
Yeah, that's beautiful, because actually yesterday I was on a show that hasn't aired yet, and the gentleman asked me exactly to your point, but what if I'm bound by a particular job that doesn't afford me a creative outlet? And so exactly what you just said, I said, well, how about instead of then spending 5 hours watching TV after you leave your job, take that ceramics course that you had always hoped to be taking. You became a pediatrician because your dad is a pediatrician and his dad is a pediatrician, but you really wanted to be a ceramics artist. Well, that's fine, but you could still go sign up at the Lifelong Learning Institute and take that ceramics course and hence channel your creativity.
Yeah, or go fishing or whatever that means to you. I mean, it doesn't have to be, different things, different people create that experience. And it is important, though, to pay attention to it.
Beautiful. Okay, earlier you mentioned that you were talking about one of the mechanisms that we were discussing, and you said, well, we don't learn that at medical school.
Yeah.
So that serves as a perfect segue to my last guest prior to you, is a gentleman by the name of Randy Nesse, Nesse, which I would love to connect you two together. Randy Nesse is a psychiatrist by training, but his big claim to fame in academia has been that he's one of the two pioneers of evolutionary medicine. The idea of, and the reason why I'm mentioning is because I know that we both are, big fans of applying evolutionary thinking to all sorts of contexts. And so he has been trying assiduously for close to 4 decades to increase the exposure that medical students receive to the evolutionary lens. And alas, he hasn't been very successful. What can we do? Can you offer any advice, whether it be to Randy Nesse or anybody else who's listening, how we can try to Darwinize medical school in a more effective manner?
This is going to sound like I'm sidestepping the question, but the fact that it has not started at the undergraduate level is shocking to me. That if you have to take a certain amount of biology as part of the requisites for medical school, if that is not being taught through the basic, I mean, I had a formal biological training. I was a biology major in college, and biology and evolution were the identical words to me. Any question in biology, I had to consult evolutionary thought. And by the way, because I went to a liberal arts college, everything was taught to me in a historical context. Here's what Faraday was thinking when he came up with these equations, and here's what Newton thought, and here's what he came up with next, and here's how he went from these derivations. It just, it just took me through the history of the thinking. So I was always connected back to something like Darwin. The fact that that is not being taught and kids are just getting these rote memorization of biochemical pathways, that is disgusting. It is missing the point of what we're doing in biology.
Well,
and by the way, I noticed that there don't seem to be even taught the scientific method.
Indeed,
they don't seem to. I'll ask, have you do you know the scientific method? And they don't really. They've never heard of a null hypothesis and basic simple kinds of chi-squares and things of an analyzing the validity or invalidity of a null hypothesis. Nope. Well, so how do you build off anything if you don't have that to start with?
Well, I mean, it's one thing that evolutionary thinking not be coupled, in biology in general. It is the framework that unifies biology across all units of analysis, whether it be at the ecological level or individual level or cellular or molecular. Okay. But now try to go now into the behavioral sciences.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it be in economics or political science or anthropology. I mean, anthropology does have a subset of biological anthropologists, but largely speaking, they've been completely overtaken by the cultural anthropologists who reject biology. I'm housed in a business school, try to apply evolutionary thinking to understand consumer psychology, economic decision-making. People look at you as though you're some kind of quack monster. What kind of pseudoscience bullshit is it to apply evolutionary theory to study the human mind? Well, what do you mean? How else do you think that the human mind came to be? But it is still today, Drew. I've been almost a professor for 30 years. It is still a very contentious statement to argue that the human mind has evolved through the forces of evolution.
That's insane. Sorry. I'm sorry that you were putting up with that. But I do think there's a way in. But by backing in through cultural evolution.
Right.
How is it that cultures evolve but brains don't? How's that possible?
Right.
How could that? I mean, and by the way, when you want to look at the behavior of ants, don't you look at the pheromones and the neurosystems and things that are being affected by the context in which they're operating? They evolve into different kinds of ants because of those things. They literally change their biology.
Can I give you their answer? The answer of what I call the flat earthers of the human mind, which is almost every single one of my colleagues. They would say that's precisely what differentiates us from every other species. It's a form of religious thinking, right? What makes us human is that we transcend our biology. So, Dr. Drew, don't tell me about ant pheromone. Don't tell me about cortisol level of baboons. That's why they're animals and we're not. We transcend our biology. We're cultural.
Question would be, how do I practice medicine then? How is there such a thing as medical science where we look at the patterns of biological processes that happen to human beings? How's that? And I can tell you when certain things happen, they affect the brain certain ways. Brains get sick just like bodies, and bodies can make brains sick. How's that possible?
Well, I'm so glad.
Possible? How am I talking nonsense? We better get rid of medical schools. That's it. Yeah, they got to get no more medicine.
I'm going to come back to evolution and medicine in a second, but the way you just framed your rebuttal is a perfect segue. So let me ask you this. How is it possible for a physician and two gynecologists, and I just did a Saad Truth on this. So there are two Saad Truths that I want you to respond to. One,
I know this one. I know where you're going, but
you know where I'm going. Okay, so there is a physician who's not a gynecologist and two other gynecologists, all three of whom agreed that it is shocking how simpleton current science is in not recognizing that Dylan Mulvaney is absolutely, this is, by the way, a male, he's got a penis and testicles, that anyone who thinks that they are not, that person is not a woman needs to go back to medical school. Now, I interacted, and then I also had a anesthesiologist engage with me. I did another Saad Truth where she said, well, I went to medical school and you didn't. And I can confirm that, some, women have 9-inch penises, something to that effect. So how is it possible? Now, I'm asking this as the person who wrote The Parasitic Mind right here. So I know all about parasitized brains. But let me ask you, how could a person who went to medical school utter such nonsense? Help us, Dr. Drew.
I don't know what they're wanting. I will agree that words like woman and man bleed into gender, and gender is a topic that is extremely difficult to navigate. And if they want to talk about genderness, go ahead. But if we want to talk about reproductive biology, I only know one way to talk about that. I don't know how.
So you confirm that men have penises and women have vaginas. I'm asking a medical expert here because, by the way,
people that produce lots of gametes that are small with high levels of testosterone that start in utero
are male.
Typically, they're male. They may or may not have a penis, by the way. I mean, the external genitalia can be ambiguous. There can be all kinds of stuff.
True.
But that does not make that thing less a male. What they'll point at is things we used to call like testicular feminization, which is a male that doesn't have the receptors for androgens and therefore has a female phenotype. Yeah, we can talk about genotypes and phenotypes, and then we can talk about gender. But let's not confuse all those things. I think people try to obfuscate these things to sort of, I don't know, make a point or something. Keep them really clean and clear, and then we can all talk.
So here's my explanation from The Parasitic Mind as to why they do that.
Okay.
Because in this, so I argue that all of these idea pathogens, postmodernism, biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain human phenomena, social constructivism, all of these idea pathogens share one thing in common, and that is they wish to remove, have freedom from the shackles of reality. Now, why? Because they're pursuing some noble goal. And in the service of that noble goal, if I have to murder and rape truth, so be it. So they take on a consequentialist ethic. So I need to be compassionate and kind towards trans people. Gender dysphoria does exist. We've documented it for a very long time.
I hope you would be.
Exactly. And therefore, in their orgiastic, full and misplaced empathy, they then say, all bets are off. I'm willing to murder truth in the service of that noble goal of having more empathy. Well, that's grotesque.
And you're getting into this. It overlaps with these theoretical frames in post-structuralism that maintain that subjectivity is the only reality, and objectivity is the domain of old racist white men, as is logic, and therefore of no value. And I don't know, we've done okay with that, in terms of building rocket ships and things.
And mapping the human genome.
And all of that. It required objectivity, open objectivity, extreme lack of subjectivity. Subjectivity gets involved, it adulterates everything. So I don't quite get it. What I find semi-comical is I listened to a French philosopher a couple months ago, and she was probably about my age, and she was absolutely bewildered by the American preoccupation with philosophers that are nearly 100 years ago, that the French dispensed with 50 years ago as irrelevant and as worthless. Just word games rather than anything of meaningful.
Is this the Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, that gang?
All those guys.
Okay.
All of them. Gobbledygook. And Foucault did untold harm on the medical health system, on the mental health system. He took the fundamental philosophy that all mental health conditions are caused by the context in which people are cared for, meaning the hospitals. Therefore, we must get rid of all the hospitals. There were several administrators in this country that took that philosophy, dismantled the healthcare system, and they were all disgorged to the nursing homes, the prisons, and the streets where they remain.
Amazing. I don't know if we've discussed this the last time that you came on my show, or maybe when I went on your show, but even if we did discuss it, it's worth repeating. I'm asking you to speculate here. Do you think that the Lacan, Foucault, Derrida types, in the deep recesses of their private thoughts knew that they were full of shit, or
I have seen Chaussure in particular seemed to have his tongue deep in his cheek. They were playing word games.
Yeah.
And I
I
think they
agree.
were laughing to themselves. I would not put Lacan in that same group, but Derrida and Chaussure, I think they were playing word games. They were laughing their asses off, and the French caught up to it 50 years ago. And we have not. They're certainly 70 years ago. So we're coming in on 100 years ago that these people are considered relevant to today. It's bewildering. And it must serve some other function for people, because it's not a great philosophical system.
So here's my thinking. So you said they were saying it tongue in cheek. I think actually, and here I'm completely speculating, so I've got no evidence for this, but I think it's a reasonable hypothesis. I think that there was an evolutionary mechanism at play here, which is, so I'm Jacques Derrida.
Yes,
I get up in front of an.
Yes.
Do you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead, finish it. Yeah. I think you're right.
So I'm seeking status, because I know
right.
that if I get status, I'm going to get the hot women. So now I get up in front of an audience and I start spewing gibberish. Now there's a great trick that happens. The audience has one of two choices. They can either say, I'm not understanding a word that he's saying because he's a charlatan, or I don't understand the word that he's saying because I'm too dumb and he's saying something very profound. And most people pick the latter.
It's something in between that, I think. You know who tipped me off this was Rob Henderson. Do you know Rob?
Oh, I do.
Okay, you got to interview Rob. I finally got to meet him in person. He's another mensch amongst mensches. You know what I mean? Between you, Bhattacharya, and Rob Henderson, these are wonderful people with great stories and fantastic thoughts.
Thank you.
And I said, why are they doing it? He said, it's a way to get published. Essentially, it's a new way of thinking about things that people haven't done before. So I'm applying literally a new slide rule. And so I can think all these new great thoughts that haven't been thought for before, even though they may have no relevance to reality.
Absolutely.
It gives you a place to go. So it is about status. It is about job. It is about publishing. It is about just using your head in novel ways. Maybe something interesting will come of it. Certainly a lot of destruction has come from it.
I think his name, I'm trying to remember his first name. I think it's Colin Martindale. He's now passed away. I think it's Colin. I can't remember his exact name. I'll send you the link to the book after. He proposed the theory about how art movements change. And he basically said that the selection pressure is simply novelty of the new form. So the new form can be complete bullshit, but as long as it's novel and unique, there are selection pressures for it to be picked. So in that sense, that fits with what Henderson is saying regarding what the postmodernists are doing. As long as I start saying some gibberish that nobody else has heard before, then it must be cool and new, and I'll sign up for it. Yeah,
and it's another lens that they're applying. They don't realize this lens is, I don't know, got some issues.
Okay,
well,
I want to.
Interesting things will come. But listen, I always feel as though, I'm sort of a Hegelian. It's like I believe that these things move forward, and they eventually we get rid of all the bullshit, and we can synthesize it into something useful. Because look, there are some wonderful things being maintained. I think awareness of people's experiences and racial biases, and this is extremely important. It should be top of mind. Look, I've been I think I told you this the other day. I've been practicing diligently to educate myself and to be careful of my perspective, which is a white male in his 60s, and that is my perspective, and I can improve. I what I think really broke through for me was reading Frederick Douglass's biographies and lectures.
Right,
it broke through for me. He had a point of view where I was like, oh my God, I get what he's talking about. I totally get it, and I did not include that in my repertoire before. And my God, everyone, he is. In this country, he is the fact that we don't, all this, there's all kinds of things we are teaching in schools right now. He should be right front and center, because logic, erudition, wonderful thought, important.
To your point, I had Brian Kilmeade, whom you know from Fox. He was on my show a few months ago because he has a book on the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. So It shocks me that more Americans don't know about Frederick Douglass, but yet we waste our time with Ibrahim Kendi.
And Brian and I have gotten into it deep on this thing, because I both of those guys I'm preoccupied with, and I've read lots of biographies on both of them. And Lincoln really backed. We're getting off the happiness topic here, my friend, but Lincoln was how I backed into sort of history and biography. I'm like, who is this guy on the penny? What? He's just some sort of myth figure to me. There's got to be a person there. And so I began reading and read many, many, many biographies. And it was that it was actually through Grant through Lincoln, I got into Grant, and Grant, how I got into Frederick Douglass.
Well, coming back in a historical way to happiness, I recently had on my show Donald Robertson, who's a gentleman who is a cognitive behavior therapist, who is very much steeped in Stoic philosophy. And he wrote a book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. Marcus Aurelius. Great book, by the way. You should read it if you haven't.
I think I've leaped through it. I've been through it a little bit.
Yeah, okay. And while I was reading How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, it came to I was surprised to find out that Galen was the personal physician of Marcus Aurelius. So then I started doing a deep dive into, can I find the definitive biography on Galen? And it turns out that there is a woman, a historian of medicine at University of Georgia, who's written a book called The Prince of Medicine. I tried to get her on the show. She hasn't responded yet. It always pisses me off when someone doesn't respond. I mean, what? Of course. It makes no sense. But anyways, so, and not because it's me writing to you, but just it's one colleague writing to another to have a conversation about your book. Why wouldn't you respond? But anyways, so do you know anything about guys? I mean, these guys strike me like these mythical creatures, Galen, Hippocrates. Have you done any deep dives on these guys?
No, I've really not. I come across stuff, along the way in sort of the Renaissance and Middle Ages and things. And there's always reference back to these guys, but I don't know much about them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's too bad. So I want to come back for a second. I said that I would come back to evolution and medicine. So I want to follow one more line of thinking, and then we can get into some of the contemporary current events, not necessarily medical, that we can talk about. So are you familiar with the term biophilic architecture or evolutionary?
No, tell me.
So the idea basically, biophilia is a term that was introduced by E.O. Wilson, the Harvard entomologist, Harvard evolutionary biologist, this innate need to interact with nature, right? So if you've got, biophilic architecture basically is the idea that rather than trying to create buildings that, maximize, the speed at which you put up the building or minimize the cost of putting up the building, you try to think about what are some ways by which having a biophilic environment, exposure to sunlight, windows, greenery, sound of water, how would that improve the experience as you navigate through internal spaces? Now, I'm going to link it in a second to, you're going to see in medicine. So there are some studies, and I actually discuss a couple of them in the happiness book. For example, there was a classic study in 1984 by Ulrich. I think it was either in Science or Nature. What he did is he took two groups of patients, exact same surgery. One of them was placed in a room with a window. The other one without. Everything else was controlled for. All other things equal. Just that manipulation had an effect on people's, trajectory.
Yeah.
So the question then to you, Drew, is why is it that all restorative environments, whether it be when I go to see the physician, when I go to the hospital, anything, if I'm not already sick, I'm going to become, my soul is going to get sick because it's so ugly, dreary, and hellish. What's going on?
So I can tell you the reality, which is I worked in a hospital that was fashioned after what's called the Life Institute or something in Connecticut, which was a psychiatric hospital, which was an old Gothic central building with nursing stations and rooms. And it needed, when you need that kind of supervision, there was sort of a medical kind of a unit. But most of it was cabins and sort of these little satellite units with acres and acres of beautiful grounds for people to walk around in, and lots of windows. Everything had windows. And it was sort of connected to the environment of this facility. Everything was connected almost. It was more than homey, more than park-like. It was sort of, it felt therapeutic. It was Zen-like, and it was clearly modeled, back in the day when they had not much else to do to people, but get them to kind of cool out,
Right.
and stop drinking, or to stop being manic, and to kind of get some TLC and walk around the grounds, and sit on your porch, and then they'd stay for weeks or months. The problem with that is the resources for medical care don't give a shit about that.
Yeah.
And they literally would tell us, we don't care about your grounds. That's your problem. We'll give you what we reimburse people to treat an acute manic episode, whether it's in a cinder block or in these beautiful environments. It doesn't matter to us. That's your problem. Good luck.
So then the only way to convince them that those kinds of interventions are necessary is to link it to the currency that they understand, which is literally monetary currency. If I can show you that you will stay in the hospital, whatever, something that affects your bottom line, then that could appeal to them. Otherwise, this sounds like hogwash aesthetic stuff. We're a serious medical establishment. We don't deal with that stuff.
They might gloss it with that, but the reality is, here's what we pay for these things. And the hospital down the street has 4 patients in a room, and they do it for less. So good on them. That's it, period. It's just do it. It's everything in medicine now is do it for less, do it for less, do it for less. He's not paying attention to these kinds of things.
Just last week, I think last Friday or the Friday before, I had the co-authors of a book that I seem to be plugging a lot of people's books. I hope I get some of their royalty cuts. There's a book called, I think you'd enjoy it, Drew, Your Brain on Art, or let me just check what it's called. Hold on. I'm going to put it up here.
I've read a number of books like that. So
this one right here, and it's basically arguing exactly what we're talking about. Now,
yeah.
just artify the place a bit.
And by the way, we had art therapies. Nope, no more. Can't afford them.
Really?
Oh yeah. No, forget
it. And from your experience, I mean, you may have not done the official scientific studies with the controls and so on, but did you get a sense that art therapy offered some benefit that otherwise
the outcomes to the psychiatric patient were abysmal, and they didn't care. They didn't care. It's weird. I would squeeze extra days out of hospitalization by scaring the reviewers with medical jargon, because they knew nothing about medicine, but they claimed infinite knowledge about psychiatry, and they were just some nurse sitting in not even a nurse necessarily, somebody sitting in a clerk in a room with a diagnostic code book in front of them, and that was it. This gives you that, and that's the end of it. And if you don't meet their criteria for continued stay, and again, hard to measure it with psychiatric patients, how to objectify all the parameters that they needed objectified in a way that reflected the reality of the patient. Didn't care.
So
so here's how it works.
Sure.
Here's how it works. So patient leaves and kills himself. The insurance carrier goes, we don't practice medicine. There's Dr. Pinsky's name on the discharge. He discharged the patient. He's responsible. That's the game.
So have all those realities caused you to kind of feel cynical or disillusioned?
I left the field. Between that and the opioid overprescribing, it was too much for me. I left it. Couldn't run a program anymore. Yeah.
Now,
we never made any money. We never made any money. It was just always a bad business to be done well. To do addiction treatment done well is not a good business. But we had a guy at the helm who was a recovering guy himself, and it saw value in it and wanted it as a, just as an important community member to provide excellent services for addiction recovery. Once the bottom liners came in, that was the end of that.
Wow. Okay, so let's move now to a few current issues. Then we'll wrap up this part, and then I will ask you a question in part 2, only for subscribers. As a medical professional, and I understand you're not diagnosing him from afar, you're not his physician. Do we feel that it is a good idea for supposedly the most powerful country in the world to be proposing as the next president Joe Biden, or does he look, at least from my layman's perspective, that his cognitive decline is very, very fast and precipitous. What are your thoughts on that, Drew?
He, I mean, it's a loaded question, obviously. He has done much better than I expected.
In terms of his cognitive acuity?
Yes, I think he's done kind of well. Given what I thought I was seeing at the beginning, I thought we were in real trouble, and that did not progress in the manner I thought it would. So I'm relieved to tell you that I think he's done rather well. Clearly, the people that are doing the governing, I don't know how much decision making comes to him or not, but there's a lot of governing going on that has some, I mean, there's some really excellent people in some positions of authority or doing some really good work. It drives me crazy when he gets up and keeps talking about the topics that add to the division in this country. I just wish he just wouldn't say it. I would be much more happy. I'm concerned that he's had 3 falls. 3 falls in an 80-year-old predicts death within 5 years, very high probability.
I mean, is that a literal?
Yes, falling is, as Warren Buffett's partner Charlie Munger says, he's going to sit in a wheelchair because fall is the major risk he has in life going forward as a centenarian. But it also is predictive. It's quite predictive of future trouble. So I worry about that. And I'm a little offended that we're not allowed to know what his cognitive status is, or is he? I mean, it's got to be. Listen, I'm at 65. My cognitive status is not what it was at 40. It just isn't. I hope it's as good as his as 80. I'd like to know what kind of horsepower he's operating with, but it is concerning. It is concerning, isn't it? But look, I'm concerned about putting anybody over the age of 70 in that office. I think it's ridiculous. We certainly have smart, capable people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And why can't we tap into that? What is wrong with us?
Well, you know,
bring them forward.
At my university, you're forced to go into no more than halftime at age 71. So why would it be the case that it is mandated for professors to either retire or go on semi-retirement at 71, but you can have your finger on the, metaphorical red button and you could be next to the grave? It's unbelievable.
It is it's wild, isn't it? It's look, we've had impaired people in that office before. That's the other thing. I want to always remind people when they go into a panic about this. Woodrow Wilson was essentially brain dead for several months, and his wife was making a lot of decisions, an unelected official in no office whatsoever. I don't know if you're aware of that. He had a massive stroke. By the way, interestingly, it was on the heels of the 1918 flu that he had. And famous psychiatrist named Menninger chronicled some of the neuropsychiatric stuff that came out of the 1918 flu, which is very similar to what we're seeing with COVID now.
Imagine is that right?
Teddy Roosevelt was a severe narcissist with bipolar disorder, ran amok for many years and finally burned himself out. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had such severe depressions. He had an obsession. There's a book called The Lincoln Marriage, where the author brings out communications, documented letters that he maintained throughout the early years in the White House with his physician in Springfield, Missouri. He had an obsession that he developed syphilis from contact with a prostitute, and that physician put him on mercury, which he maintained well into the White House years. The number one side effect is severe depression, and Lincoln's depressions were notorious, where people had to take sharp objects away from him. He was pulling Tad down the street one day on a red wagon. It flipped over. He walked all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue without being aware that his son was sitting in the street a mile up.
Wow.
Huge level depressions. So we've had problems in the office. I always want to warn people, if they think that the modern situation is that much different, we've had problems in the past. Trust me.
Hey, Drew, I just had a book idea for you. Why don't you write a book, like a medical biography of all of these presidents? I don't think it's been done.
It has been done, but never collated, never put together. So it'd be very interesting. Yes, it would. That would be a lot of work.
That would be a lot of work. Wow, that's very cool. Okay, this is a non-medical question, a legal one, but of course you've got a highly functioning brain, so you can weigh in on it. We don't have to only talk about medical things. Okay. What are your thoughts about the multiple every 4-second arraignments of Donald Trump, or as I like to call him, Orange Himmler?
What I don't like is that the political types have taken things to the point where we're behaving like a banana republic, whereby either the current president or the leading candidate is going to put one another in jail. I mean, you can pretty much bet if Trump becomes president, he's going to do the same thing to Biden. This is terrible. This is atrocious. And I'm very concerned about where we've taken politics. It's just gone to some blood sport. And I just, that's my grave concern is again, the division.
I mean, one of the things that I admire or appreciate in Alan Dershowitz is that despite the fact that he is an avowed liberal, he doesn't stop reminding us that, you know, he didn't vote for Donald Trump and he's a liberal. He adheres to deontological principles, right? He swears allegiance to the Constitution, and therefore he comes along with complete intellectual honesty and says, hey, look, I may not have voted for Donald Trump, but this is not good. Why can't we get some of our common progressive liberal friends to have that kind of intellectual honesty?
I'm just generally, since COVID started, I've been just asking myself, what is going on? What is happening? I'm trying to put the pieces together. I've kind of put it together a little bit with COVID. I can't understand why people cling to ideas that are problematic, wrong, and add to division and trouble. I don't get it.
Is it just orgiastic tribalism that,
you know, tribalism for sure. I wanted to write a chapter in my book on narcissism on periods of history where childhood trauma has been predominant. And the biggest example that I came upon was the French Revolution and pre-revolutionary France. Just massive childhood trauma and abandonment of parenting responsibilities and physical abuse, all kinds of sexual abuse. And you got the French Revolution. So part of my concern is that there is scapegoating. They're telling me I have to go in a second here, my friend. That scapegoating is the outcome of that kind of narcissistic process. And I just think we're gathering in these, again, orgiastic scapegoating, and it's guillotines. We are discharging our narcissistic rage by uniting with scapegoating experiences, scapegoating phenomenon.
Gotcha. I was hoping to do a more positive ending, but can I keep you on the thing for a minute just to ask you one more question for our subscribers?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Drew, for coming on the show.
Always great to be here, my friend.
Cheers.